The first thing Mark said when he called me at 3 in the morning, his voice a raw shard of panic, was not that his wife was crying, but that their son was sitting in his bed, folding a paper airplane. The phone's shrill demand ripped me from a shallow sleep, a sound like a physical blow in the utter darkness of my rectory room. I fumbled for the receiver, my hand shaking slightly, a chill already settling over me before I'd even spoken. Midnight calls were rarely good. 3 a.m. Calls were almost always catastrophic. I mumbled a groggy, "Father Michael," and then Mark's voice hit me. It wasn't just panic. It was something wilder, something unraveling at the very edges of sanity. It was the sound of a man who had stared into an abyss, and the abyss had stared back, not with darkness, but with something far more terrifyingly luminous. He didn't waste a second on pleasantries, on apologies for the hour. He didn't even preface it with a gasp for breath. His words tumbled out, each one a jagged stone skipping across the thin ice of my sleep-addled mind. "Father, it's Daniel. He's in his room. He's folding a paper airplane." This was, of course, impossible. My mind, still half asleep, wrestled with the words, trying to slot them into some semblance of reality. It couldn't. It couldn't because I, Father Michael, had stood at the altar a mere 18 months ago, vestments heavy with the weight of sorrow, and watched as Daniel O'Connell, 7 years old, was laid to rest. I had seen the small white coffin. I had spoken the prayers over the grave. I had offered communion to his parents, broken and lost. Daniel was gone. Daniel was dead. There was no sitting in his bed, folding a paper airplane. There was only dust and memory and a grief that had ripped a family apart. I gripped the phone, the plastic cold against my clammy palm, certain it was a dream. A cruel, malicious dream that had somehow snaked its way into both Mark's mind and my own. Or worse, a prank. A grotesque, unforgivable prank born of grief. A desperate lashing out from a man who had lost everything. But the ragged breathing on the other end of the line was terrifyingly, brutally real. It was the sound of a man suffocating on disbelief. It was the sound of a man on the very precipice of breaking. "Mark," I managed, my voice rough. "What are you saying? You need to calm down." Calm down. His laugh was a dry, brittle thing, devoid of humor, laced with a hysteria that pierced the silence of my room. "Calm down? Father, how can I calm down when my son, my dead son, is sitting in his room? He's real. He's right there, like he never left." The silence that followed was dense, suffocating. I tried to find a logical explanation. Sleepwalking? A different child? The house guests? But Daniel was an only child. And the specificity, folding a paper airplane, struck me with an unnerving precision. It was too mundane, too ordinary a detail to be a delusion, and yet the context made it utterly monstrous. Then he told me about Elena, his wife. My mind conjured her image. A woman whose faith had been both her anchor and her tormentor since Daniel's death. Mark's voice dropped, almost a whisper, as if he feared the walls might hear him. "Elena, she's in the hallway, on her knees. She's not crying from sorrow, Father, not from grief. Her tears, they're a kind of silent, petrified awe, like she's seen God himself, and he's both beautiful and terrifying, and she can't move, can't breathe. Petrified awe." The words lodged in my chest. Grief I understood. Despair I had seen countless times. But this was a new category of human experience, one that defied every theological lesson, every pastoral encounter I had ever faced. What kind of awe makes a mother who has buried her child weep tears of stone? What kind of vision freezes the soul? He wasn't asking me what to do. There was no rational what to do here. He wasn't asking for advice or comfort or even prayer in the traditional sense. He was begging me to come. "Please, Father, just come and see. Tell me I'm not losing my mind. Tell me I haven't finally shattered. Before I call the police, before I call an ambulance, before I do something irreversible." Irreversible. The word hung in the cold night air. He wasn't just seeing things. He believed what he was seeing was real enough to warrant official intervention, medical or legal. He needed a witness. A spiritual witness, yes, but more than that, a witness to the impossible. He needed someone, anyone, to validate the reality of what stood before him, or to confirm his own descent into madness. And he had chosen me. I threw off the covers. The sudden chill of the room a brutal awakening. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the silence. Every instinct screamed for caution, for analysis, for the measured rational response of a priest trained in the earthly and spiritual needs of his flock. But there was no measure here. There was no rationality. There was only the unbearable weight of Mark's plea, the ragged edge of his sanity, and the chilling, impossible assertion that his dead son was alive again, mundane and miraculous all at once. The impossible contradiction hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A dead boy was in his room folding a paper airplane. and his parents, a couple already fractured by an unbearable loss, were breaking apart not from the memory of his death, but from the searing, undeniable, horrifying reality of his presence. It was a contradiction that shattered the very fabric of belief, of life, and of death. And I, Father Michael, was about to step directly into its terrifying heart. To understand the impossible contradiction that clawed at Mark's voice that morning, to truly grasp the monumental, soul-shattering weight of what he believed he was witnessing, you must first understand the silence, not merely an absence of noise, but a living, breathing entity that had suffocated the O'Connell home for 18 long months, a silence far more profound and chilling than any shriek of panic could ever be. It was the silence born of an unbearable grief, a silence that had not just muted joy, but had actively consumed it, leaving behind only echoes of what once was. Before the accident, the O'Connell house had been a symphony of everyday life. Mark, a carpenter with hands strong enough to fell oaks and gentle enough to cradle a newborn, had built much of it himself, imbuing every beam and floorboard with his quiet strength. Elena, a kindergarten teacher with a laugh that tinkled like wind chimes, had filled it with warmth and light. Their love story, simple and profound, was a quiet inspiration in our parish. They were the kind of couple you pointed to when you spoke of marital grace, always holding hands, finishing each other's sentences, their eyes mirroring a deep, abiding affection that seemed impervious to the world's cynicism. And then there was Daniel. Oh, Daniel, a boy of 7, with eyes the color of summer skies and a boundless energy that expressed itself in 1,000 small ways, perpetually scuffed knees, a collection of intricately folded paper airplanes, and an infectious giggle that could chase away any lingering shadows. Their home, a charming colonial nestled beneath a venerable oak, had once hummed with his presence. I remember Sunday afternoons when I'd visit, the air thick with the scent of Elena's baking and the joyful cacophony of Daniel's imaginary adventures, the thud of a soccer ball against the garage door, the breathless accounts of newly discovered bugs in the garden, the earnest questions about saints and angels posed with a solemnity only a child can muster. These were the sounds that defined the O'Connell house. It was, in every sense of the word, a home built on love, nurtured by faith, and alive with the vibrant promise of a family's future. Then came that scorching afternoon in July, a day that promised only the innocent relief of cool water and sunshine at the community pool. A momentary lapse, a turn of the head, a splash unheard amidst the boisterous shouts of other children, a tragic inattention. The details even now are a blur of communal horror and whispered regrets. It was one of those terrible, wrenching moments that rends the fabric of a small community, leaving an indelible scar on every heart. Daniel, their beautiful, vibrant Daniel, was gone. The funeral mass was the hardest I had ever presided over. I remember Mark, usually a man of such composure, his face a mask of bewildered agony, holding Elena as she crumpled beside the small white casket. The raw, primal scream of a mother losing her child, though silent, resonated through the hallowed space, shaking the very foundations of our faith. We buried Daniel beneath a young dogwood tree, and with him, it seemed, a part of the O'Connells' very souls. In the days and weeks that followed, the initial outpouring of communal grief slowly receded, leaving behind a silence in their home that became more suffocating than the initial shock. The vibrant colonial, once a haven of laughter and light, transformed into a mausoleum of grief. The toys Daniel had left scattered, once charming reminders of his play, became stark monuments to his absence. Elena, in a ritual of profound sorrow, would meticulously arrange them each night, as if preparing for a child who would never again burst through the door. Mark, however, couldn't bear to touch them. He'd simply walk past the small, silent room, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if acknowledging them would be to acknowledge the gaping wound in his heart. Mark, a man of profound but simple faith, found it not merely challenged, but utterly shattered. His God, the loving, benevolent creator he had known and trusted his entire life, had become an incomprehensible, cruel enigma. How could a good God permit such an atrocity? How could such innocent joy be so brutally extinguished? He wrestled with these questions not with theological inquiry, but with the visceral anguish of a father whose world had been irrevocably broken. His once bright eyes became clouded, distant, reflecting an internal landscape of desolation. His grief, rather than softening into sorrow, hardened into a cold, impenetrable anger. And that anger, in its brutal and relentless march, found its target. Elena. She had been the one watching Daniel that day. She had been the one distracted for those fatal moments. He never uttered the words aloud, not once, for Mark was a man who rarely spoke his deepest wounds. But his every action screamed the accusation, echoing in the cavernous silence of their home. It was your fault. It began subtly, an almost imperceptible shift in the way he moved through their shared life. The gentle touch he once offered her arm, the shared glance across a room, the casual intimacy of their routine, all vanished. He would eat his meals in a stoic quiet, eyes fixed on his plate, only acknowledging her with a curt nod or a monosyllabic answer when directly addressed. If Elena began to speak of Daniel, her voice trembling with a fresh wave of sorrow, Mark would rise from the table, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor, and retreat to his study, leaving her alone with her memories and her shame. I remember once, during one of my visits, finding Elena attempting to mend a tear in Daniel's favorite teddy bear, her fingers trembling as she worked the needle. Mark walked into the room, paused, and without a word, picked up a newspaper from the coffee table, carefully folding it, before walking out. The air thickened with what was left unsaid, with the palpable tension of two souls adrift in the same unforgiving sea, yet utterly unable to reach each other. The simple act of mending a toy, an act of loving remembrance for Elena, was for Mark a stark, unbearable reminder of the life that had been lost, and the person he held responsible. He couldn't bear to witness her grief, for in it, he saw his own, and the person he believed caused it. He stopped attending Mass, or if he came, he would sit in the very back pew, a solitary figure shrouded in shadow, leaving immediately after the final blessing, avoiding all eye contact, particularly mine. When I tried to speak with him, to offer a word of comfort, a reminder of God's boundless mercy, his gaze would drift past me, unfocused and empty. "Father," he'd say, his voice flat, devoid of its former warmth, "what comfort is there in a God who would take a child?" He asked it not as a question seeking an answer, but as a statement of irrefutable fact, a declaration of a faith irrevocably broken. There was a hardness about him now, a granite-like resolve to hold on to his anger, as if letting it go would be to betray Daniel, to diminish the injustice of his death. It was the only way he knew how to continue to love his son, by clinging to the righteous fury of his loss. He'd taken to working late, finding solace in the unyielding demands of his carpentry, the tangible creation of something new, a stark contrast to the destruction that had ravaged his family. Elena would wait for him, often by the window, the glow of the porch light casting long, lonely shadows on the silent driveway. When he finally arrived, the house would sink further into its oppressive quiet, the unspoken words between them a heavy, suffocating blanket. His very presence, once a source of comfort and love, now felt like a judgment, a constant, chilling reminder of her perceived failure. He wasn't overtly cruel. There were no shouting matches, no flung accusations. Instead, it was the chilling absence of kindness, the void where affection once resided, that spoke volumes. It was the careful avoidance of her gaze, the deliberate distance in their shared bed, the way his shoulders would subtly stiffen if she accidentally brushed against him. These silent rejections were wounds far deeper than any spoken word. The vibrant heart of the O'Connell home had not just stopped beating, it had been replaced by a slow, agonizing echo of accusation and unutterable sorrow. Their marriage, once a testament to enduring love, was slowly, painfully dying, piece by excruciating piece, suffocated by a grief that had metastasized into resentment. This was the landscape of their lives, the broken ground upon which the seed of an impossible miracle was about to fall. And the silence, that awful, terrible silence, was the loudest witness of all. That awful, terrible silence, the one that had become the loudest witness of all, was not merely an absence of sound, but an absence of life. It permeated every corner of the O'Connell home, and indeed, every facet of their being. For Mark, it was the sound of a God who had abandoned him, leaving behind only the echoing emptiness of a question that had no answer. For Elena, it was the ceaseless drone of her own culpability, a silent internal scream that no amount of self-imposed penance could quiet. And for me, it was the agonizing whisper of a love story, once so vibrant, now slowly suffocating, struggling for breath in a world suddenly devoid of divine grace. Mark, as I've said, had always possessed a faith both profound and simple. It was the kind of faith that understood the cycles of seasons, the quiet assurances of a sunset, the steady rhythm of a loving family. He believed in a God who was fundamentally good, a benevolent father who shepherded his flock through green pastures. But Daniel's death had not just fractured that faith, it had, in Mark's eyes, utterly shattered it. He couldn't reconcile the image of a loving God with the brutal reality of a small, lifeless body. His once gentle, open heart had hardened, like clay left too long in the sun. The sorrow he felt was a vast, unnavigable ocean, but the anger that simmered beneath it was the treacherous current that pulled him further and further from shore, away from God, away from Elena, and ultimately, away from himself. He stopped coming to Mass. The empty pew, just 3 rows from the front where he and Elena and Daniel had always sat, was a stark testament to his departure. At first I would see him on occasion, standing awkwardly at the back, his gaze fixed not on the altar, but on the ground, Then even those fleeting appearances ceased. I would call, offering an invitation for coffee, a visit, anything. His replies were always polite, always distant. "Thank you, Father Michael, but I'm just not myself these days." And what was himself, I wondered? A man consumed by a silent, suffocating rage, who could no longer speak of Daniel without his jaw clenching, without a shadow passing over his eyes, without the palpable, unspoken accusation hanging in the air between him and Elena. Elena, however, responded to their shared tragedy with a path that diverged sharply, and in its own way was just as heartbreaking. While Mark's faith had evaporated into a bitter void, hers had intensified, curdling into a desperate, constant act of penance. She had been a devout woman before, yes, but her devotion had always been one of joyful participation, of communal celebration. Now it was a solitary, punishing ritual. I would see her every morning, without fail, at the earliest Mass. The church, still cool and hushed in the pre-dawn light, would have only a few souls scattered like lonely islands in the vast pews. But Elena would be there, always in the same spot, third row, aisle seat, her back ramrod straight, her head bowed. Her rosary beads, once a comforting rhythm for reflection, now seemed an instrument of self-flagellation, her fingers moving over them with a fierce, almost frantic urgency. I saw the way her lips moved, silent prayers whispered so intensely that I could almost feel the vibration of her pleas across the sacristy. Her face, perpetually pale, was etched with a sorrow so profound it seemed carved into her very bones. There were faint, perpetual shadows beneath her eyes, the hallmark of sleepless nights spent wrestling with unspeakable grief and unspeakable guilt. When she came forward for communion, her steps were almost a shuffle, her gaze lowered, as if she felt unworthy even to approach the Lord's table. And after the last blessing, after everyone else had quietly departed, she would remain, sometimes for another hour, kneeling, her body a silent, trembling testament to the crushing weight she carried. Her prayers were no longer petitions for comfort or solace. I learned later, in hushed conversations in the confessional or over cups of undrunk tea, that her ceaseless whispers were pleas for expiation, for a punishment she felt she so richly deserved. She didn't pray for Daniel's return. She knew the sacred boundaries of life and death. She prayed instead for a sign that he was at peace. Yes, but interwoven with that, almost inextricably, was a desperate entreaty for her own suffering to be acknowledged, for her guilt to be purged through a relentless mortification of the self. And her penance extended far beyond the walls of the church. She sought out every opportunity for service, not as a means of spreading joy, but as a path to self-abasement. She became a fixture at the local soup kitchen, arriving before anyone else, taking on the grimiest tasks. I'd see her scrubbing floors on her hands and knees, the abrasive scent of industrial cleaner filling the air, her slight frame bent over the worn linoleum. She'd wash dishes until her hands were raw and chapped, serve meals with a bowed head and a voice so soft it was barely audible, her eyes carefully avoiding contact, as if she feared that looking into another's face might somehow infect them with her own perceived contamination. She cleaned the church bathrooms, polished the brass, meticulously tended the parish garden, pulling weeds with a fierce concentration, as if each thorny root represented a sin she could physically uproot from her soul. Her clothes, once tasteful and bright, became muted, almost indistinguishable. Her hair, which she used to wear in soft waves, was often pulled back severely. There was a deliberate plainness to her, a shedding of anything that might draw attention or suggest vanity. It was as if she were trying to disappear, to become an invisible vessel for her endless atonement. She fasted regularly, her already slender frame growing thinner, her cheekbones more pronounced. I worried about her, often. Her body, I knew, was simply struggling to keep pace with the relentless demands of her spirit. She was engaged in a spiritual warfare, not against temptation or evil, but against herself, against the insidious conviction that she was unforgivable. I tried to counsel them both, of course. It is a pastor's duty, his sacred calling, to offer guidance and solace in times of profound suffering. My heart ached for them, for the beautiful, vibrant family they had been. I approached Mark first, cautiously, delicately, sitting with him in his quiet study, the air thick with the unspoken. I spoke of God's boundless mercy, of the parable of the prodigal son, of the woman caught in adultery, of Christ's own words on the cross, "Father, forgive them." I reminded him that forgiveness was not just a human virtue but the very cornerstone of our Catholic faith, a mirror of divine love. I spoke of how anger, left to fester, consumes the soul, turning the very love that once animated it into a destructive poison. He would listen, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond my shoulder, his polite nods almost imperceptible. He would respond with platitudes, with assurances that he appreciated my concern, that he was just getting through it. But his eyes remained shuttered, his heart a fortress he refused to open. My words, I quickly realized, were like stones skipped across a frozen lake. They made no impression, leaving only faint, quickly vanishing ripples on a surface too hardened to receive them. With Elena, my task was equally daunting, perhaps even more so. She was receptive, yes, but utterly immovable in her conviction. I would sit with her after Mass, or in the parish office, offering a gentle hand on her arm, a reassuring smile. I spoke of God's infinite mercy, of the sacrament of reconciliation, a gift designed precisely for souls burdened by guilt. I reminded her that while remorse was a healthy and holy emotion, self-flagellation was not. Daniel, I gently suggested, would never want his mother to live a life so consumed by sorrow and self-reproach. He would want her to find peace, to live in the light of God's love. She would look at me, her eyes brimming with tears, her voice a fragile whisper. But Father, how can I ever be forgiven for my carelessness, for my failure? Mark cannot look at me without seeing it. And how can God, in His perfect justice, not see it too? She believed truly and deeply that her suffering, her isolation from Mark, the slow, agonizing death of their marriage, was her deserved punishment. She saw it as divine retribution, a just consequence for a momentary lapse that had shattered their world. My reassurances of God's limitless forgiveness, of grace freely given, seemed to brush against an invisible shield, bouncing off the impenetrable wall of her self-condemnation. She would agree, nod, say, "Yes, Father, I know," but her actions, her relentless pursuit of penance, never wavered. Her spirit was so profoundly broken, so utterly convinced of its unworthiness, that it clung to suffering as if it were the only anchor left in her storm-tossed life. Their marriage, once a beacon of love in our parish, was dying. It was not a sudden, dramatic collapse, but a slow, agonizing erosion, like a magnificent cliff face slowly worn away by the ceaseless pounding of the waves. The vibrant colors had faded, replaced by the muted grays of resentment and despair. The shared laughter, the easy affection, the quiet understanding, all had been replaced by a chilling politeness, a careful avoidance, an unbearable quiet that spoke volumes of the chasm between them. Elena believed it was her deserved punishment, and in that belief, she found a perverse kind of peace, a grim acceptance of her fate. And Mark, trapped in his own prison of unforgiveness, saw no way out, no path back to the man he once was, to the life they once shared. The silence in their home was not just the absence of sound. It was the deafening roar of two souls drifting irrevocably apart, their once interconnected lives now two separate, lonely planets orbiting a sun that had long since burned out. It was into this deep, profound, and utterly human despair, where all human intervention had failed, that the divine was about to break through, in a way neither of them could ever have imagined. The deafening roar of two souls drifting irrevocably apart, their once interconnected lives now two separate, lonely planets orbiting a sun that had long since burned out. This was the reality I faced in my attempts to minister to Mark and Elena. My words, as I confessed in the previous chapter, were like stones skipped across a frozen lake, making no impression. Their marriage was not merely struggling, it was disintegrating, atom by atom, into a black hole of unexpressed grief and unforgiveness. Elena, in her quiet, unwavering penance, believed this disintegration was her rightful due, a just sentence for a crime she could neither forget nor fully atone for. And Mark, entombed in his glacial anger, seemed content, in a perverse and agonizing way, to remain in his self-made prison, the bars forged from his son's memory and his wife's perceived culpability. It was into this deep, profound, and utterly human despair, where all human intervention had failed, that the divine was about to break through, in a way neither of them could ever have imagined. And the vessel for this breakthrough, as it so often is, was a mother's heartbroken prayer. The night before Mark's desperate call, the night before the impossible unfolded within the O'Connell home, was the second anniversary of Daniel's death. The calendar itself seemed to weep, each tick of the clock a fresh wound. I remember the day with a clarity that time has done little to diminish. A solemn, heavy air hung over our small parish, a communal memory of a bright, vibrant little boy snatched away too soon. There was a special mass that morning, hushed and somber, and I had seen Elena there, as expected. She was a fixture in the front pew now, a living testament to faith forged in the crucible of suffering. Her movements were always deliberate, her face composed, yet I could always detect the subtle tremor in her hands as she received the host, the slight catch in her breath during the consecration, small tells of the tempest that still raged beneath her placid surface. Mark was not there. He rarely was. His absence was a silent sermon, a testament to his rejection of a God he felt had abandoned him. That evening, as dusk bled across the sky, painting the chapel windows in bruised purples and oranges, I found myself drawn back to the church. A holy hour was scheduled, an evening adoration before the Blessed Sacrament. It was a time of quiet reflection, often sparsely attended on a weeknight, and even more so, I suspected, on an anniversary so painful. But I felt a pull, a pastoral instinct, urging me to return. Perhaps it was a premonition, or perhaps simply the accumulated weight of the day's sorrow. But something told me I needed to be there. The chapel was almost empty when I entered through the sacristy door, easing it shut behind me with a soft click that seemed to echo in the profound stillness. The only illumination came from the sanctuary lamp, a tiny crimson star burning steadily beside the altar, and the soft, diffused glow from the adoration chapel itself, where the monstrance holding the sacred host gleamed like a small sun. A few candles flickered in their stands, their fragile flames dancing in the silent currents of the air, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched and shrank on the ancient stone walls. The air was cool, carrying the faint, comforting scent of old incense and beeswax, a fragrance that always spoke to me of ages of prayer, of generations of hopes and fears laid bare before the divine. And there she was, Elena. She was kneeling in the very first pew, closest to the altar, her head bowed so deeply that her dark hair fell like a curtain around her face, shielding her from the world, from me, from everything but the transcendent presence before her. She was a solitary figure, utterly absorbed, utterly consumed. The chapel, vast and echoing moments before, seemed to shrink around her, drawing all focus, all gravity, to her trembling form. I watched her from the shadows of the sacristy for a long time, my own heart aching with a profound, almost unbearable empathy. I had seen sorrow in countless forms throughout my years as a priest. I had witnessed the raw animal wail of sudden loss, the quiet, dignified grief of a life well lived and gently concluded, the bitter tears of regret, and the weary sighs of resignation. But Elena's sorrow was different. It was a living thing, a palpable presence that clung to her like a shroud woven from pain and guilt. It wasn't the fresh, blinding agony of the initial shock that had long since passed. This was a deep, unceasing ache, a chronic spiritual wound that refused to heal, festering beneath the surface of her daily existence. Her body was indeed trembling, as the summary noted, but it wasn't a violent shaking. It was a subtle, internal tremor, as if every nerve ending, every fiber of her being was vibrating with an intense, sustained emotion. Her shoulders hunched, a posture of profound submission. Yet there was also a fierce, almost defiant resolve in the unmoving stillness of her pose. She was not merely kneeling, she was rooted, a living prayer rising from the very depths of her soul. What words could I offer a soul in such a state? What comfort could I truly impart that the Lord himself could not? I knew the answers. None. My role, at times like these, was simply to be present, a silent witness, a fellow traveler on the path of faith, acknowledging the sacred space she was creating with her suffering and her unwavering devotion. I breathed my own quiet prayers for her, for Mark, for Daniel, for the fractured pieces of their lives to somehow find their way back to wholeness. I prayed for light to pierce the darkness that had enveloped them for so long. The minutes stretched into an hour, then more. The few other attendees had long since departed, leaving Elena and me alone in the silent vigil. I remained in the sacristy, not wanting to disturb her, allowing her the sacred solitude of her intimate conversation with God. I watched the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders, imagining the whispered words, the silent pleas, the tears that surely flowed unseen beneath the curtain of her hair. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was perhaps only a few hours, the time came for me to close the chapel. I stepped out from the sacristy, making my presence known with a soft rustle of my cassock. Elena stirred, slowly, as if waking from a deep trance. She lifted her head, and for the first time that evening I saw her face. It was streaked with dried tears, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, but there was also a clarity there, an almost ethereal glow that seemed to emanate from within. It was the look of someone who had wrestled with angels, who had journeyed to the furthest reaches of her spirit and found something profound. She looked exhausted, utterly spent, yet somehow lighter. "Father Michael," she said, her voice a reedy whisper, raw from disuse and emotion. "Elena," I replied gently, moving towards her, my heart aching with a mixture of profound sorrow and deep reverence. "Are you all right, my dear?" She didn't answer immediately. She simply rose, her movements stiff, and then, with a profound sigh, she slowly approached the altar, genuflected before the Blessed Sacrament with a reverence that bordered on adoration, and then turned to me. I needed to be here, Father," she said, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond me, as if still seeing the face of God. "Tonight, of all nights." I nodded, understanding unspoken. The weight of the anniversary, the crushing memory of Daniel, the isolation from Mark, it had all culminated in this profound act of prayer. Would "Would you walk with me for a moment, Father?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I think I need to tell someone." We walked slowly out of the hushed chapel, through the echoing main body of the church, and into the cool, dark vestibule. The streetlights outside cast a dim amber glow through the stained glass windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, forgotten stars. I offered her my arm, and she took it, her fingers surprisingly cold through the fabric of my sleeve. We found a quiet bench in the church gardens, beneath the ancient oak that had stood guard over our parish for generations. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and late-blooming jasmine. I sat beside her, simply listening, waiting. I knew this was not a casual conversation, but a confession of the soul. She began slowly, haltingly, her words punctuated by shivers that were not entirely from the cold. She spoke of Daniel, of course, of the enduring agony of his absence. She spoke of Mark, of the ever-widening canyon between them, of the words never spoken but always felt. And then, she spoke of her prayer. "I know what people say, Father," she began, her voice gaining a fragile strength. "They say time heals. They say God doesn't give us more than we can bear. They say I need to forgive myself. But how? How do you forgive yourself for a life that is gone? For a marriage that is broken beyond repair?" I listened, offering no platitudes. There were none to offer. "I came here tonight, Father," she continued, twisting her hands in her lap, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "I came here with a prayer that felt selfish, presumptuous even. I know we shouldn't ask for miracles, not for our own desires. We should pray for God's will." She paused, taking a ragged breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to reveal. "But tonight I asked anyway. I laid my heart bare, Father. All the ugliness, all the despair, all the desperation." I gently touched her arm. "God knows your heart, Elena. He welcomes all of it." She looked at me then, her gaze intense, searching. "I did not pray for Daniel's return, Father," she said, her voice firm now, imbued with a strange, resolute peace. "I know that is impossible. I know death is final, a part of our fallen world. I know Daniel is with the Lord. I believe that with every fiber of my being. He was a pure, innocent soul, and he is surely in the arms of our Blessed Mother, playing in the fields of heaven." My heart swelled at her words. Even in her deepest pain, her theological foundation remained firm, her faith unwavering in the ultimate goodness of God and the hope of eternal life. This was not a woman consumed by despair, but one who, even amidst the ruins of her life, held fast to the pillars of her belief. "But Father," she continued, a fresh wave of tears springing to her eyes, "I needed a sign, just a sign, any sign at all, that he is happy, that he is at peace, that he remembers us perhaps in that beautiful place. Not for him, Father, for us, for Mark and me, to know that our sweet boy is truly, truly well, and that his suffering on this earth was only for a moment." I swallowed, my throat tight. This was a mother's plea for reassurance, a yearning for connection across the veil between worlds. It was a perfectly human, perfectly understandable request, rooted not in denial but in a profound, enduring love. It spoke of a desire to anchor their hope, however fragile, in something tangible, something divine, that could bridge the immense chasm of grief. It was a plea for a whisper from heaven, a gentle confirmation that their Daniel was truly home, not lost to the void, but resting in a peace beyond all earthly comprehension. Such a sign, I knew, was not about bringing him back, but about bringing peace to them, a balm for their wounded souls. It was a request born of love, not of magic, or a refusal to accept reality. "And then," she said, her voice dropping to an almost inaudible whisper, her grip tightening on my arm, I added one more plea, the hardest one, the one that felt sacrilegious almost, a prayer of ultimate sacrifice. She turned her head away, her gaze fixed on the distant outline of the rectory, her profile stark against the dimly lit night. I could feel the immense struggle within her, the battle to articulate something so raw, so deeply personal, so utterly self-abnegating. "I prayed, Father," she finally managed, the words tearing from her like fragments of her own soul, "that God would give Mark peace, even if it meant he could never forgive me, even if it meant I had to live the rest of my life alone." The words hung in the cool night air, shimmering with an incandescent, heartbreaking purity. I felt a sudden, profound shock ripple through me, a gasp that caught in my own throat. My mind struggled to fully grasp the enormity of what she had just said. Even if it meant he could never forgive her, even if it meant she had to live the rest of her life alone. This was not a prayer born of resignation, but of absolute, unconditional love. It was a love so profound, so utterly selfless, that it was willing to sacrifice its own happiness, its own earthly solace, its own right to companionship and forgiveness, for the sake of the beloved. It transcended every human expectation, every instinct for self-preservation. It was a prayer that mirrored, in its own humble way, the ultimate sacrifice on the cross. I looked at Elena, really looked at her, and saw not just a grieving mother, not just a guilt-ridden wife, but a soul stripped bare, purified by suffering, brought to a point of such profound spiritual insight that it could offer up everything it held dear for another. It was a love so vast, so encompassing, that it could endure its own perpetual suffering, if only the object of that love could find peace. "Elena," I murmured, my voice hoarse, filled with an awe that bordered on reverence. That is a prayer of pure, selfless love. A mother's heart, broken yet still overflowing with grace." She nodded slowly, tears now freely tracing paths down her cheeks. But they were different tears than before. These were tears of exhaustion, of release, of having finally articulated the deepest truth of her heart. "I didn't know what else to do, Father," she whispered, her voice laced with a raw vulnerability that tore at my heart. "I've tried everything. I've prayed for forgiveness for myself, for strength, for understanding. But Mark, he's suffering so much. He's drowning in his anger, and I know it's because of me. I am the source of his pain, the constant reminder of what he lost. And if my presence in his life, my very existence prevents him from finding peace, then I would rather bear the loneliness. I would rather bear his unforgiveness for the rest of my days, if it means he can finally lay down his burden." Her words painted a vivid, agonizing picture of her internal landscape. She saw herself as a stumbling block, an impediment to Mark's healing. In her profound guilt, she believed that her continued presence in his life was not a comfort, but a constant torment, a living accusation. And so, with a love that defied all logic, all human expectation, she was willing to remove herself, to accept a solitary, painful existence, if only it would grant him reprieve. This wasn't a martyrdom born of despair, but one born of a terrifying, beautiful clarity. She wasn't seeking annihilation. She was seeking a way to love Mark beyond the limits of her own suffering. She was, in essence, offering to pay the ultimate price for his peace, to become a scapegoat for his grief, accepting a lifetime of isolation as a testament to her unending love for both her son and her husband. I sat there, speechless, grappling with the magnitude of her sacrifice. In all my years, I had rarely encountered such profound selflessness, such an utterly stripped-down offering of love. It was a prayer that didn't ask for personal gain, for solace, or even for justice. It asked for the well-being of another at the complete and utter expense of one's own. It was a prayer that acknowledged the limits of human intervention, the absolute failure of their marriage to heal itself, and turned, with a desperate, unwavering hope, to the divine. This was not a prayer of a saint in a stained-glass window, but a prayer of a broken, ordinary woman, pushed to the very edge of her endurance, finding an extraordinary grace within her shattered heart. It was a prayer offered from the deepest well of a mother's broken heart, not for the impossible but for the profound, for peace for her lost son, and for peace for the man she still loved, even as he implicitly condemned her. I understood then, in a way I had not before, the true depth of Elena's faith. It was not a faith of convenience or comfort. It was a faith forged in fire, a faith that endured not because life was easy, but because God was God, even in the desolation. And it was a faith that understood the essence of Christian love. To lay down one's life for one's friends, to put the needs of others before one's own, to seek their peace even at the cost of one's own. As we finally stood, the late-night air growing chillier, I offered her a simple blessing, my voice still thick with emotion. I held her hands, felt the cold tremor still in them, and looked into her eyes, conveying all the understanding and compassion I possessed. I knew in that moment, with a certainty that settled deep into my bones, that this prayer, this raw, selfless outpouring from Elena's heart, had somehow opened a door, a channel for grace that transcended all human expectation. She left then, a solitary figure disappearing into the amber glow of the streetlights, her silhouette carrying the immense weight of her unspoken sacrifice. I stayed behind, alone in the quiet garden, gazing up at the countless stars that now peppered the vast, inky blackness above. Each star seemed to pulse with a silent promise, a whisper of divine intervention. I felt a stirring in my spirit, a sense of anticipation, as if the very fabric of the universe had heard her plea, a plea so pure, so devoid of self, that it could not be ignored. It was a prayer that was about to be answered, not in the quiet, gentle ways we often expect, but in a manner so breathtakingly miraculous, so utterly impossible, that it would forever redefine the boundaries of their belief, and indeed my own. God, in His infinite mercy, was about to step into their profound human despair, into the unbearable quiet that had consumed their home, and reveal the true power of a mother's love and the boundless reach of His grace. The stage was set, not by human design or human will, but by the quiet, trembling prayer of a broken heart, asking not for itself, but for the peace of others, even at its own ultimate expense. And it was into this sacred space of selfless love and profound longing that the impossible, the miraculous, would finally break through. Mark came home that night, not to the welcoming glow of a porch light, nor to the scent of a late-cooked meal that might have offered a fleeting promise of comfort, but to the pervasive inky blackness that had become the true sentinel of the O'Connell home. I can only imagine the chill that must have seeped into his very bones the moment he stepped from the cool night air into the house, a chill that had nothing to do with the external temperature. Though the late autumn air was indeed sharp and unforgiving, the house, I surmised, held a different kind of cold, a spiritual frost that had settled deep within its timbers, clinging to every surface. The very air, I imagined, felt heavy, almost viscous, as if the silence itself possessed a physical density, pressing in from all sides, a palpable weight upon the soul. It was a silence not born of peace or the gentle hush of slumber, but of an absence, a gaping void where laughter, the joyous clatter of toys, and the vibrant cacophony of a child's life once resonated. This was the quiet that now dwelled in every corner, clung to every curtain, and permeated every breath drawn within those walls. It was the unbearable quiet I had spoken of, a testament to a love fractured and a hope all but extinguished, a tomb-like stillness that echoed the emptiness in both their hearts. Mark pushed open the front door, the faint click of the latch echoing disproportionately loud in the oppressive stillness, a tiny sound swallowed immediately by the vast emptiness. He didn't bother to switch on the overhead light, for even a flicker of artificial brightness felt like a transgression against the solemn darkness that had claimed the house as its own. His shoulders were slumped, his gait heavy, each footstep a dull thud against the wooden floorboards, the sound hollow and unwelcoming. He was a man carrying not just the weariness of the day, of countless hours spent at the office trying to outrun his thoughts, but the cumulative exhaustion of 18 months of unremitting grief, of a spirit slowly being eroded by an acid of anger and sorrow. Each step into the house felt like a descent into a familiar, painful purgatory, a landscape he knew intimately, yet one that still managed to inflict fresh wounds with every return. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones and tasted like ash on his tongue, what he would find. Elena, always Elena, adrift in the desolate sea of her sorrow, navigating the same treacherous currents of memory and loss that had long since capsized his own spirit. I often wondered if the predictability of her grief was almost as tormenting to him as the grief itself, for it offered no escape, no variation from the painful script they were both trapped in. His faith, once a sturdy oak rooted deeply in the rich soil of childhood innocence and a loving home, had been splintered by the lightning strike of Daniel's death. Now, only the gnarled roots of anger remained, anchoring him to a bitterness that had become his sole, albeit toxic, companion. It was an anger that had calcified around his heart, forming a hard, impenetrable shell, protecting him, he believed, from further pain, but in truth isolating him from the very solace he desperately needed. He had come to view Elena's demonstrative grief not as a shared sorrow, a poignant echo of his own profound loss, but through a distorting lens of resentment and accusation. To his embittered mind, her constant tears, her endless prayers, her desperate acts of penance, they were not expressions of her own suffering, but a perpetual accusation, a living monument to his boy's absence, and worse, a constant visceral reminder of the day she had been watching. In the cruel, twisting logic of his grief, her sorrow became a performance, a public display of guilt that he found intolerable. He never said the words aloud, not once, not in the quiet intimacy of their bedroom, nor in the sterile silence of a therapist's office, for they were too terrible to utter, too destructive to unleash, even for him. Yet, every closed-off glance, every sigh held back, every shared silence between them screamed the unforgivable indictment. It was your fault. This silent internal dialogue had become the very rhythm of his existence, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out any whisper of compassion, any echo of their once vibrant love, any chance for healing. It was the wall he had built between them, a barrier thicker and more unyielding than any stone. He moved through the house with the practiced stealth of someone avoiding tripwires in a minefield, each step cautious, deliberate, lest he disturb the fragile, dangerous peace of the night. The kitchen, tidy and unused, held the ghostly echo of meals Daniel would never again fuss over, of spilled juice and sticky fingers. Its polished surfaces reflected the ambient gloom, cold and unwelcoming. The living room, pristine and cold, waited for a warmth it would never again receive. Its carefully arranged cushions and untouched books, silent witnesses to a joy that had vanished. His steps led him inexorably towards Daniel's room, a place he simultaneously longed for and dreaded with an almost physical ache. It was a sanctuary of memory for Elena, a sacred space where she could commune with her lost son. For Mark, however, it was a torture chamber, a museum of what-ifs, and never-agains, each object a fresh stab of pain. The door was ajar, a sliver of faint yellowish light spilling from within, a beacon in the pervasive gloom. It was the glow of a small bedside lamp, I imagined, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the stillness. He paused at the threshold, bracing himself, his hand hovering near the frame, reluctant to enter, yet unable to turn away. The scene within was exactly as he expected, yet each time it struck him with renewed force, chiseling away another fragment of his weary soul, deepening the ruts of his despair. Elena was there, as she always was, kneeling on the faded blue rug beside Daniel's bed, her back to him, her slight frame a picture of utter desolation. Her body was a tableau of profound grief, her shoulders trembling with silent sobs that seemed to shake her very core. She clutched something to her chest, something small and familiar, something that had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. He could just make out the faded colors, the uneven lines, a child's earnest effort. It was one of Daniel's early drawings, a triumphant, if anatomically questionable, crayon rendering of a superhero flying through a sky of exuberant scribbles, a burst of primary colors against cheap paper, a picture of pure, unadulterated joy that now served only to deepen the chasm of their sorrow, to underscore the vibrant life that had been so cruelly extinguished. A familiar cascade of emotions washed over Mark, a fresh wave of raw pain, the searing burn of his anger, and beneath it all, a deep, pervasive weariness that threatened to collapse him. He saw her tears, not as a shared expression of a father's agony, but through that distorting lens of resentment he had carefully constructed. It was a performance, he told himself, a ritual of guilt and self-punishment that she indulged in night after night, a public penance that had become a bitter spectacle in his eyes. Her constant, visible lamentation, her endless prayers whispered at Mass, her desperate acts of charity, they all seemed to him a grand, tragic display, a desperate, futile attempt to atone for something he believed was unforgivable, something that had stolen his future. He saw it as a perpetual reopening of the wound, a refusal to let the scar tissue form, a constant demand for him to remember, to relive, to share in her unceasing penance, to witness her guilt. He felt no urge to comfort her, no softening of his rigid heart, only a deepening of his cold internal resolve. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating, woven with unspoken words, with 18 months of accusations, with years of love transmuted into bitterness. He watched her for a long moment, the light from the small bedside lamp illuminating the sheen of tears on her cheeks, the fierce grip of her hands on the fragile drawing, as if it were the last tether to sanity. He saw the tremor that ran through her slight frame, the way her head was bowed in an attitude of utter defeat, her hair falling around her face like a dark curtain. And still he stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unwilling to offer the smallest gesture of solace, a hand on her shoulder, a whispered word. The chasm between them had grown too wide, the bridge of their shared love long since collapsed, the pieces floating as debris in the dark waters of their separate sorrows. Finally, with a sigh that was more a physical expulsion of exasperation than sorrow, a deep guttural sound of weary resignation, he took a step back. The movement was imperceptible, a subtle shift in the stillness, but to him it felt like a monumental retreat, a surrender not to peace, but to the crushing weight of their brokenness. He reached out, not to her, but to the doorframe, his fingers brushing against the cold wood, and with a soft, deliberate motion, he pulled the door shut, severing the sliver of light, plunging Daniel's room, and Elena within it, back into a deeper, more profound darkness. It was an act of profound separation, a reinforcement of the wall he had meticulously constructed around his heart, brick by painstaking brick. The soft click of the latch was a final damning punctuation mark on their brokenness, sealing her off in her grief, and him in his. He made his way to their bedroom, the silence a roaring condemnation in his ears, each beat of his heart a painful echo in the void. The room they had once shared with such joyous abandon, a space once vibrant with laughter, whispered secrets, and the warmth of shared intimacy, now felt like a lonely, expansive wasteland, as cold and desolate as the rest of the house. The bed, once a haven of comfort and shared dreams, was now a desolate island where two separate souls sought refuge from each other, separated by an invisible yet insurmountable barrier. He shed his clothes mechanically, the movements devoid of consciousness, his mind a turbulent sea of anger and sorrow, roiling waves of resentment crashing against the shores of his despair. He climbed into bed, pulling the covers up, the chill of the sheets a stark reminder of the emotional coldness that had seeped into his life. Turning his back to Elena's side, as if even the empty space beside him held the ghostly imprint of her perceived transgression. Sleep, when it came, was not a balm, but a torment. It was fitful and fractured, haunted by the images that relentlessly cycled through his mind, a cruel kaleidoscope of memory and pain. Daniel's laughing face, forever etched in his memory, vibrant and alive. The terrible sun-drenched day at the community pool, the bright light contrasting so brutally with the darkness that followed, the suffocating embrace of a grief that had stolen his son, and, piece by agonizing piece, his wife, and always, Elena's tears. The image of her weeping in Daniel's room, clutching that childish drawing, burned behind his eyelids with an almost phosphorescent glow. But in his darkened mind, those tears were not for his boy, not for their shared loss, not for the beauty of memory. No, they were tears of guilt, tears of a failure that he could never, would never, forgive. That image, rather than softening his heart, fueled the cold anger that had become his only companion, a constant bitter ember in his soul. It was a cruel irony, but that anger, sharp and unyielding, was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that gave structure to the formless void of his sorrow. It was a shield, a weapon, a prison he had built for himself, brick by brick, from the rubble of his shattered faith. He tossed and turned, caught in the suffocating grip of his bitterness, trapped in a cycle of resentment and self-pity that offered no exit, no glimmer of dawn. The hours bled into one another, each one heavier than the last, pushing him deeper into a profound despair, a spiritual exhaustion that seeped into his very bones. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, silent and still, a mausoleum to a love that had died with a child. It was in the deepest part of that night, in the hushed pre-dawn hours, when the world outside still slept in a profound darkness, that God chose to answer a mother's prayer. Not with a gentle whisper in the heart, not with a subtle shift in perception, not with the slow, arduous work of human grace, but with an intervention so direct, so undeniable, so utterly miraculous, that it would tear down the walls of unforgiveness that Mark had so carefully constructed. In that house, broken by what could not be forgiven by human will, where a father's heart had hardened into stone and a mother's had offered its ultimate, selfless sacrifice, the divine was about to break through the unbearable quiet, shattering the silence not with thunder or earthquake, but with a grace beyond all human comprehension. The stage was set, not by human design or human will, but by the quiet, trembling prayer of a broken heart, asking not for itself, but for the peace of others, even at its own ultimate expense. And it was into this sacred space of selfless love and profound longing that the impossible, the miraculous, would finally break through, illuminating the darkest corners of human sorrow with the undeniable light of God's infinite mercy. The world, I have found, often feels most profoundly when it is held in a single breath, suspended between what was and what could never be. That drive to the O'Connell house in the pre-dawn stillness felt like such a breath. The city was asleep, a vast dark canvas under a sky that had not yet decided if it would offer stars or simply a bruised gray. My headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating empty streets that usually teemed with life. Each turn, each stretch of road, was an eternity. My mind was a whirlwind of prayers and desperate questions. Had grief finally consumed Mark entirely? Had Elena, after all her penance, broken under the unbearable weight of her sorrow? Or, God forbid, was there something far more sinister? A delusion born of agony, a cruel trick of the mind. But Mark's voice, though raw with terror, had been lucid, painfully real. And Elena's tears, he'd said, were not of grief but of a petrified awe. The phrase itself was a knot in my stomach. Awe? Petrified in the face of their dead son? What madness was this? My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, urging me forward while my soul recoiled, whispering warnings of despair, of what faith could not explain, or worse, what it might be forced to endure. Yet, I drove. For them. For Daniel, even if only in memory. And perhaps for myself? For the bedrock of my own faith that now felt like a shifting dune beneath my feet. I offered Hail Marys like frantic birds, released into the suffocating quiet of my car, each one a plea for clarity, for understanding, for the grace to face whatever impossible truth awaited me. As I pulled up to their familiar driveway, the house stood like a dark silhouette against the faintest hint of purple on the horizon. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, making the familiar seem alien, imbued with a sinister beauty. But then I saw it. The front door, ajar, not wide open, but just enough to show a sliver of darkness within, an invitation, or perhaps a desperate omission in their panic. It hung there, a silent witness to the shattering of normalcy. I parked, killed the engine, and stepped out into air that was cold and damp, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp leaves. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that pressed against my ears, amplifying the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the gravel path. I pushed the door open gently. It creaked, a sound like a gasp in the profound stillness. "Mark? Elena?" My voice, usually deep and resonant, sounded thin, swallowed by the cavernous quiet of the entryway. No answer. Only that pervasive, expectant silence. It wasn't the silence of a sleeping house. It was the silence of a paused moment, a held breath, charged with an almost unbearable tension. It felt different from the mournful silence that had consumed this home for 18 months. The silence of a mausoleum I had come to know too well. This was a silence that buzzed, a stillness that thrummed with an unseen presence. My clerical collar suddenly felt tight, a band of steel around my throat. I moved slowly, drawn by an invisible current, towards the back of the house, towards Daniel's room. Each step on the plush carpet was muffled, absorbed, as if the very house was holding its breath with me. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth emanated from that direction, a gentle warmth that chased away the chill of the morning air. And with it, a subtle sweetness, not cloying or artificial, but like fresh linen, or a memory of sunshine, utterly out of place in a house steeped in such sorrow. My heart pounded a rhythm against my ribs that seemed too loud in the enveloping quiet. And then I saw them. They were exactly as Mark had described, yet so much more profound, so utterly unearthly, in person. Mark stood frozen in the doorway of what had been Daniel's room, his back rigid, his shoulders hunched, not in anger, I realized, but in an utter, crushing stillness. He was a statue carved from disbelief and awe, his frame utterly unresponsive to my entry, as if the universe had shrunk to the single, impossible tableau before him. He wore the same rumpled clothes from the night before, his hair disheveled, a testament to the hour and the shock that had consumed him. He was not looking at me. His gaze was fixed, unwavering, upon the scene within the room. And Elena, my dear, broken Elena. She was kneeling on the floor, not in the hallway as Mark had first said, but just inside the room at the foot of Daniel's bed. Her hands were pressed together, not in prayer in the traditional sense, but clasped tight against her mouth, stifling any sound. Her face, tear-streaked and blotchy from hours of silent weeping, was now utterly transformed. The lines of grief were still etched there, the shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes, but overlaid upon it was an expression I had never seen on any human face. It was indeed petrified awe, but mingled with it, flowing from her eyes like an unchecked river, were tears of unbelievable joy. They poured down her face, glistening in the dim light, but her lips were turned upwards, slightly, in a silent, trembling smile that spoke of a grace so profound it bordered on pain. She was utterly motionless, a supplicant not to God in general, but to the very manifestation of him before her. My breath hitched. My own legs, without conscious command, took a step forward, then another, until I too stood at the threshold, just behind Mark. And then I saw him, sitting on the very edge of the small twin bed, his bare feet dangling just above the floor, was Daniel. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the image with 18 months of grief, with the tiny casket I had stood over, with the eulogy I had delivered, the tears I had shed for a life so tragically cut short. But there he was. He was not a ghost, not a shimmering, translucent apparition that flickered at the edges of perception. He was solid, real, tangible. He wore his favorite blue pajamas, the ones with the tiny rockets on them, a detail so specific, so utterly Daniel, that it screamed reality. His brown hair, just a little tousled from sleep, caught the soft light that surrounded him. And oh, that light. It was not a spotlight, not a beam from the window, for the sun had not yet crested the horizon. It emanated from him, a gentle golden glow that softened the edges of everything in the room without casting harsh shadows. It seemed to pulse with a serene internal energy, a warmth that radiated outwards, filling the small space, making the air feel almost viscous, like honey. It was the light of a summer morning, of a cherished memory, of the purest, most profound peace. It was divine. His small hands were busy. He held a piece of notebook paper, its lines barely visible in the gentle radiance, and with an absorption that only a child can possess, he was expertly folding it. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his tongue just barely peeking out between his lips as he meticulously creased the paper, transforming it, with precise, familiar motions, into a perfect paper airplane. The rustle of the paper, soft and delicate, was the only sound in the room, a counterpoint to the deafening silence of our collective awe. He didn't speak, not a word. There was no need. The sheer impossible fact of his presence, solid and luminous, was a symphony, a sermon, a revelation. Every fiber of my being, every theological precept, every human understanding of life and death, shattered and reassembled in that single holy instant. This was not a dream. This was not a hallucination. For Mark and Elena and I, three separate witnesses, were seeing the same impossible truth. This was a miracle, undeniable, profound, a direct, unequivocal intervention from the divine. Then, as if sensing the weight of our gazes, Daniel looked up. Slowly, deliberately, his busy hands paused their work. His eyes, clear and bright, not the dull, vacant eyes of death, nor the feverish eyes of a spirit, but the warm, intelligent eyes of a child, held a wisdom that no 7-year-old could possibly possess. They were filled with an ancient, knowing peace. He looked first at his mother, and in that gaze, in the gentle curve of his lips as he offered her a smile of pure, untainted love, Elena's silent, pent-up grief, her 18 months of self-condemnation seemed to visibly melt away. It was a smile of recognition, of boundless affection, of profound, unburdened peace. It was the smile a child gives a mother, but amplified by the love of eternity. A silent affirmation that she was seen, she was loved, she was forgiven. A wave of indescribable relief washed over her face, deepening the joyful tears that continued to stream down her cheeks. Then, Daniel shifted his gaze. His eyes, still holding that same gentle, knowing wisdom, moved past Elena, past me, and fixed on his father, Mark. My friend, whose heart had become a fortress of anger and accusation, whose faith had crumbled into dust. Daniel's gaze upon him was different from the one he had given his mother. There was no immediate smile. Instead, it was a look of quiet intensity, of deep understanding, perhaps even of a gentle, waiting patience. It was a look that seemed to hold the weight of all the words that had gone unsaid, all the forgiveness that had been withheld. It was a clear, direct, and utterly loving challenge. In that moment, the impossible contradiction of a dead boy in his room was resolved, not in logic, but in the overwhelming, undeniable reality of God's presence, made manifest in the simple, radiant form of a child with a paper airplane. His eyes, still holding that same gentle, knowing wisdom, moved past Elena, past me, and fixed on his father, Mark, my friend whose heart had become a fortress of anger and accusation, whose faith had crumbled into dust. Daniel's gaze upon him was different from the one he had given his mother. There was no immediate smile. Instead, it was a look of quiet intensity, of deep understanding, perhaps even of a gentle, waiting patience. It was a look that seemed to hold the weight of all the words that had gone unsaid, all the forgiveness that had been withheld. It was a clear, direct, and utterly loving challenge. In that moment, the impossible contradiction of a dead boy in his room was resolved, not in logic, but in the overwhelming, undeniable reality of God's presence, made manifest in the simple, radiant form of a child with a paper airplane. And then, Daniel acted. His small hands, still luminous, lifted the folded paper from his lap. It was a simple thing, a square of blue-lined notebook paper, creased with the familiar geometric precision of a child's proud creation. But in that moment, in that room, it shimmered with an almost unbearable significance. He held it up, allowing both his mother and father, and indeed me, to see its humble perfection. It was a testament to simple joy, to a memory of innocent childhood, now imbued with the weight of eternity. His gaze never left Mark, a silent invitation, a profound gesture that transcended the need for sound. My breath caught, held hostage by the sheer, tender majesty of the scene unfolding before me. Elena, still on her knees, had ceased to weep in despair and was now utterly still, her eyes wide with a holy apprehension, her hands poised as if to receive a most precious gift. Mark, on the other hand, remained a statue of bewildered disbelief, yet a tremor, almost imperceptible, ran through his rigid frame. He was witnessing the impossible, the unfathomable, and the foundations of his grief-hardened world were beginning to crack. Then, with a delicacy that felt like a whispered prayer, Daniel extended his arm towards his mother. He did not throw the airplane. He simply nudged it from the edge of the bed, a soft, almost imperceptible push, and it did not fall. Oh, my dear friends, I have seen wonders in my life, witnessed the quiet grace of God in countless human hearts, but never have I beheld anything so utterly, breathtakingly miraculous. The paper airplane, a mere scrap of pulp, ceased to obey the laws of this world. It glided through the air with an impossible slowness, a deliberate, tender ballet of paper and light. It seemed to hang suspended, catching the faint, ethereal glow that enveloped Daniel, turning the ordinary lines of graphite and paper into something luminous, something ethereal. It drifted, not with the erratic dips and swoops of a child's toy, but with the steady, unwavering certainty of a feather descending on a still breeze, guided by an unseen, divine hand. My eyes followed its impossible trajectory, tracing the slow, silent arc through the hushed air of the room. Every fiber of my being resonated with the truth that this was not merely a trick of the light or a hallucination born of grief. This was grace made manifest, a tangible whisper from the divine. It was a bridge spanning the chasm between life and death, between sorrow and peace. The small craft floated endlessly, it seemed, until it finally exquisitely settled. It landed in Elena's open, trembling hands, not with a thud, not even with a rustle, but with a softness that felt like a blessing itself, a feather-light touch against her skin. A gasp, a quiet, reverent sound escaped her lips, yet she made no move to clutch it, to hold it tight. Instead, she simply cradled it, her fingers barely touching the paper, as if afraid to disturb the sanctity of the moment. Her tears, no longer born of sorrow or shock, now flowed freely, tears of pure, unadulterated joy, of a mother's prayer answered beyond all imagining. Daniel, his task to his mother complete, turned his gaze back to his father. He lifted his small glowing hand and, with a gesture of profound tenderness and ultimate assurance, placed it over his heart. And in that simple act, in the unwavering clarity of his luminous eyes, I felt a message resonate through the very core of my soul. A message as clear and undeniable as any word spoken aloud, yet far more potent, for it was delivered not through the ears, but directly to the spirit. She is forgiven. The words bloomed in my heart, a truth echoing from Daniel's silent gaze towards his mother, then back to Mark. I am at peace. His hand over his heart, his radiant being, was a living testament to this profound serenity. Love one another. This was the culmination, the divine mandate, a plea and a command woven into the very fabric of his innocent yet knowing expression. There was no accusation, no judgment in his eyes for Mark's years of anger, only a boundless, unconditional love that sought to heal, to reconcile, to restore. It was a love that asked for nothing in return but the release of suffering, the embracing of grace. The first faint blush of dawn began to paint the sky outside Daniel's window, a pale pink herald of a new day. And as that earthly light touched the glass, the soft internal radiance that enveloped Daniel began, almost imperceptibly, to soften, to diffuse. He did not vanish in a flash or disappear with a sound. Instead, it was like watching mist dissolve in the morning sun, or the last embers of a fire fading into ash. The edges of his form softened. The luminosity that defined him seemed to recede, absorbed back into the very air. Slowly, tenderly, Daniel was gone. But the light, the holy, blessed light, did not vanish entirely. It seemed to settle. It sank into the room, infusing the very walls, the carpet, the small familiar objects of childhood, with a profound and lasting peace. The air, which had been thick with tension and the scent of miracles, now carried a different fragrance, a stillness, a palpable serenity that hummed with the echo of divine presence. It was as if the room itself had become a sanctuary, consecrated by the visitation of a soul returned from glory. In that quiet, sacred afterglow, I witnessed a second miracle. Mark, who had stood like a pillar of stone for so long, finally broke. The rigidity left his body in an instant, and he crumpled. He fell to his knees, not with the controlled despair I had seen so often, but with the sudden, uncontrolled collapse of a man whose very foundations had been shattered and then rebuilt in an instant. He didn't cry out. He simply fell, the sound of his knees hitting the floor a quiet thud in the profound silence. And then, with a desperate, guttural sound that was more raw grief than I had heard from him in 18 months, he began to crawl. He crawled across the short distance separating him from Elena, his arms outstretched, his face a mask of crumpled, undone anguish and burgeoning hope. He reached her, still kneeling, still clutching the paper airplane as if it were spun from starlight, and he wrapped his arms around her, not in accusation, not in resentment, but in a grasp so fierce, so broken, so utterly reconciled, that it seemed to absorb all the pain of their shared past. His head buried in her shoulder, Mark wept. He wept not with the cold, isolating anger that had been his companion for so long, but with the searing, cleansing torrent of a heart finally, miraculously broken open. They were tears of profound sorrow for a son lost, yes, but more profoundly they were tears of redemption, of release, of a boundless gratitude for a grace too immense to comprehend. 18 months of anger, of silent accusation, of suffocating resentment washed away in that flood of redeemed and grateful tears. In that moment, in that embrace, beneath the settling light of Daniel's peace, their fractured marriage was not just touched by grace, it was reborn. That night, as the first rays of dawn painted the sky with a blush of hope, I slipped away from the O'Connell home, leaving them cradled in that holy, tear-soaked embrace. Their marriage, as the summary noted, was not magically repaired in an instant, as if a broken vase had simply reassembled itself without a seam. No, it was something far more profound. It was reborn. It was a seedling, fragile but full of life, bursting forth from barren ground. They had to nurture it, water it with patient understanding, and expose it to the tender light of God's grace. piece by careful piece. I watched them in the months and years that followed, and I saw a quiet transformation. The heavy silence that had once filled their home was replaced not with boisterous laughter, for the shadow of Daniel's absence would always be there, but with the gentle hum of shared life, of whispered conversations, of hands that reached out not in accusation, but in comfort. Their grief for Daniel, that raw, agonizing wound, did not vanish. How could it? A parent's love is eternal. But it was no longer a source of division, a weapon forged in guilt and anger. Instead, it became a sacred memory, a shared sorrow sanctified by a visitation they never spoke of to anyone but me. It was their secret, their holy secret, a testament to a love that had touched the veil between worlds. On their mantelpiece, nestled between a worn family photo and a small ceramic lamp, sits a simple folded paper airplane. It is slightly yellowed now, the crease is soft with time, but its message remains as crisp and clear as the morning it appeared. To anyone else it might be an overlooked trinket, a child's forgotten toy. But to Mark and Elena, and to me, it is the most sacred relic in their home. It is a tangible whisper of the impossible, a constant reminder of a love that transcends death, a forgiveness that descended from heaven itself. I learned then, in a way no seminary lecture or theological text could ever teach me, that forgiveness is more than a human virtue. It is a divine power. Our own capacity for it, even in the best of us, is finite, often exhausted by the weight of our hurts, the bitterness of our resentments. When a wound is too deep, a sin too heavy, a loss too great, we often find ourselves paralyzed, unable to bridge the chasm. But God, in His infinite mercy, in His boundless love, sometimes reaches into our broken world and sends a messenger. Sometimes that messenger is a small boy in blue pajamas, his hands deftly folding a paper airplane, his eyes filled with a wisdom beyond his years. He comes to remind us that His love, and His love alone, is the only thing that can truly make us whole, binding up our deepest wounds and restoring what we believed was irretrievably lost.